Did you know that the strongest man in the Bible, the hero who defeated entire armies, was defeated by a woman? But the most amazing part isn't Samson's strength. It's what happened when he encountered his greatest weakness. How could a woman with beauty and persuasion destroy Israel's greatest hero, the one chosen by God? What really led Delilah to betray the strongest man in the Bible? The story of Samson and Delilah is not just about muscles and epic battles. It's a story of choices, weaknesses, and betrayals. Samson's journey, a man gifted with divine strength, culminates in a tragedy that begins with a simple yet devastating mistake of trust. Samson, chosen by God to free the people of Israel, believed his strength was invincible. But deep down he was vulnerable, not to swords or spears, but to something far more dangerous, his own desires and his trust in something other than God. Delilah, a woman of cunning and charm, entered Samson's life with a secret mission. Her beauty was not her only weapon. She knew exactly how to manipulate the trust of the world's strongest man. But what motivated Delilah to betray Samson? Was it greed, fear, or something even darker and more strategic? Today we will reveal the truth behind this tragic story. What really happened between Samson and Delilah, and how did her betrayal destroy the most feared hero of the Bible? Stay until the end and discover how one of the greatest falls in biblical history also brought a lesson of redemption and true strength. Before we continue, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Let's start unraveling this story. The story of Samson begins long before his birth, in a moment of desperation and prayer. Manoah and his wife, a couple living in a difficult time, were deeply saddened by her infertility. The lack of children at that time was seen as a curse, and the greatest desire of any couple was to have an heir. Manoah and his wife's fervent prayers seemed ignored until something extraordinary happened. An angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife while she was alone and made a divine promise. She would conceive a son, even though she was barren. This son would be a Nazirite, consecrated to God from the womb until his death, and would have the mission of freeing Israel from the oppression of the Philistines, who ruled much of the land of Israel at that time. This promise was not just good news, but a direct intervention from God. The angel gave precise instructions on how Samson's mother should care for him. She could not drink wine or eat impure foods, and the boy was not to cut his hair. The Nazirite vow was a symbol of holiness and separation to God, and this vow was the key to the supernatural strength that Samson would carry with him throughout his life. Every strand of hair that grew on his head represented a direct connection to God, and as long as he maintained his consecration, divine strength would remain with him. Samson grew up knowing his life was not ordinary. He was not just a child, he was a promise, a living mission. The strength he possessed was not of his own making, but a direct gift from God, and he carried this responsibility with awareness and devotion, even though throughout his life he would face temptation and human weaknesses. As Samson grew and became the strongest man in the Bible, he also became more aware of his divine mission. However, despite his incomparable strength and crucial role in liberating Israel, he was also vulnerable to human temptations. His life was not only marked by glorious victories, but also by impulsive choices that would eventually lead to his fall. Samson's first great mistake was his decision to marry a Philistine woman, which caused great discomfort to his parents. They knew this union would not bring blessings to Israel, as the Philistine woman was not part of God's plan for Samson's life. But he, driven by his personal desire, ignored his parents' advice and went ahead with his plan, believing the union would be an opportunity to start his fight against the Philistines, as God had foreseen. This decision was already a sign that, despite his physical strength, Samson was vulnerable to his own emotions and desires. His strength, which should have been used to free Israel, was being consumed by his impulsive choices. This contrast between his great mission and his human failures would begin to intensify throughout his journey. Samson won extraordinary battles and performed heroic feats, such as killing a lion with his bare hands and defeating Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. However, his strength was not only physical, it came from his connection with God. The problem, however, was that Samson felt invincible. He trusted in his strength, not in his faithfulness to God. Now he faced a new challenge, something he never imagined. His greatest weakness was not in his physical strength, but in the emotional seduction of a woman. The betrayal. Samson's story takes an even more tragic turn when Delilah enters the scene. Until then, Samson had been an unbeatable hero, revered for his strength and victories over the Philistines. But what he didn't know was that the woman he would fall in love with would be the cause of his downfall. Delilah, unlike Samson, did not possess extraordinary physical strength, but she had something far more powerful: cunning and manipulation skills. Delilah lived in the valley of Sorek, a region close to the Philistines, which put her in a strategic position for Samson's enemies. She was approached by the Philistine leaders, who were desperate to discover the secret of Samson's strength. They knew that without this secret, he would continue to be a threat to their dominance. Promising her great financial rewards and power, the Philistines convinced Delilah to help them uncover the secret that made Samson invincible. Delilah accepted the mission, but unlike a direct enemy, she approached Samson with an appearance of trust and affection. She used her beauty and femininity to gain his trust, becoming not only his lover but also his confidant. Samson, in love and convinced he was in a genuine relationship, did not realize he was being manipulated. Delilah's first attempt was subtle. She began to question him subtly about the secret of his strength, asking if there was any way he could be defeated. Samson, trusting his beloved, gave a misleading answer. He lied, saying that if he were bound with 7 fresh bowstrings, he would lose all his strength. Delilah, eager to put her plan into action, tied up Samson while he was sleeping and called the Philistines to attack him. However, Samson, with divine strength, broke the strings with ease and the Philistines fled, leaving Delilah frustrated. But she didn't give up. With each failed attempt, she became more persistent. Using emotional manipulation, Delilah pressured Samson, making him feel guilty and insecure. Each failure only strengthened her resolve. She knew that the real battle wasn't in physical strength, but in Samson's heart and mind. He, who had defeated entire armies, was now being defeated by his own passion and the emotional manipulation of a woman. The fall and reflection. After several failed attempts to discover Samson's secret, Delilah intensified her tactics. She knew that the only way to get what she wanted was to emotionally wear down the man who considered himself invincible. Samson, in his blind confidence, didn't realize he was being slowly defeated by his own vulnerability. Delilah, with her soft words and gestures, touched his weakest point, the desire to be loved and accepted. She knew she was playing with his emotions, and he in turn didn't want to believe he was being manipulated. It was then that the emotional pressure reached its peak. Delilah, now more persistent than ever, made Samson open up in a way he never imagined. She used the power of doubt and sadness to weaken his resistance. "You don't love me, Samson," she said, with a truly pained expression, as if she was suffering from his lack of trust. "If you really loved me, you would tell me the secret you've kept for so long." This was the turning point. Samson, tired of the constant manipulations, finally gave in. He knew he was making a mistake, but the pressure and desire to be loved made him confide. He told Delilah the secret of his strength. "My strength comes from God. If my hair is cut, my strength will disappear, and I will be like any other man." The revelation was not an act of genuine trust, but the result of deep emotional exhaustion. Samson, who had always believed his strength came from his own power, finally understood that his true strength was in his connection with God. However, he had already revealed the secret, and the evil was already in motion. Delilah, hearing his words, did not hesitate to act. With a subtle smile, she did what had been planned for so long. In the dead of night, while Samson was sleeping, Delilah called a man to cut Samson's hair, the symbol of his covenant with God. His bond of strength was now on the ground, cut and destroyed. When Samson woke up, he didn't notice anything immediately. He rose, believing he could defeat the Philistines, as he had always done. But something was wrong. His strength, which had always been his ally, was no longer there. The Philistines, knowing the secret, were ready to capture him. Samson tried to fight, but the divine strength had left his body. He was now like any other man, powerless and vulnerable. He had fallen into the trap of his own weaknesses, and the confidence he had in himself had betrayed him. Samson's sacrifice. When Samson realized his strength was gone, it was too late. He tried to fight the Philistines, but his body did not respond as it once did. His reliance on his physical strength had been his greatest trap, and he could no longer lean on it. The man who once tore down gates, killed lions with his bare hands, and defeated entire armies was now prostrated, powerless before his enemies. Without his divine strength, the Philistines captured Samson easily. They bound him, gouged out his eyes, symbolically blinding him so that he would never see the light of day again. But the humiliation did not stop there. The man who had been a hero was now treated like a slave. Samson was forced to work at the millstone, grinding a heavy stone day after day in an exhausting effort, while his enemies mocked him. This transformation from hero to prisoner was painful, but it was at this moment of extreme weakness that Samson began to reflect on his life. Amid his humiliation and blindness, he realized that his true strength had not come from his muscles or the hair that had been cut. His strength had always come from his faithfulness to God. He had failed, but the Lord had not abandoned him. God still had a plan for him, even though he was captive and humiliated. Over time, Samson's hair began to grow again. This symbol of his consecration to God also represented the possibility of spiritual renewal. Samson, now physically weak and blind, began to understand that the return of his strength would not depend on his own power, but on his surrender to God and his trust in the divine purpose that still had a place for his life. The Philistine people, meanwhile, were celebrating their victory over Samson. They organized a great festival at the temple of Dagon, the Philistine god, to celebrate the defeat of the man they had feared for so long. Samson, now completely blind and humiliated, was brought to the temple as a trophy. The crowd, full of contempt, rejoiced at the fall of Israel's hero. But within Samson, something was changing. He began to realize that his true mission was not over, and that his greatest struggle, his true strength, would come not from what he could do alone, but from complete surrender to God. The final act of faith and redemption. Samson was positioned between the two great columns of the Temple of Dagon, while the crowd celebrated his defeat with shouts of triumph. He was blind, weak, and humiliated, but in that moment of total vulnerability, something deep was happening inside him. Although his body had been reduced to an empty shell, Samson's soul was being restored. He knew that this was the final moment, the end of his life as he knew it, but also the beginning of his true redemption. With his hands on the columns, Samson felt the structure of the temple around him. The cold, rough stone under his fingers seemed to convey a sense of an unfinished mission, as if God's purpose was still in motion, even in this moment of weakness. The great hero who had once trusted in his physical strength was now completely dependent on God. At that moment, Samson prayed with a contrite heart. He did not ask for vengeance or personal glory, but for something much deeper. Lord Jehovah, remember me. Give me strength just this once, so that with one blow I may avenge the Philistines for having gouged out my eyes. This prayer was an act of complete humility. Samson finally understood that his true strength did not come from his body but from his surrender and faith in God. Samson's prayer was answered in a surprising way. He, who had been the physically strongest man, now became the most powerful example of faith and dependence on God. Without any human strength, but with renewed trust in God, Samson did what seemed impossible. He pushed the two central columns of the temple with all his remaining strength. The sound of the columns cracking was like thunder, echoing through the city and causing the ground to tremble beneath the Philistines' feet. The structure of the temple began to collapse, and in one final effort, Samson used all his divine strength to bring down the columns, destroying the temple and causing the death of thousands of Philistines, including their leaders and soldiers. With this, he fulfilled the mission God had given him, to free Israel, but in a completely unexpected way. His sacrifice was the key to the ultimate defeat of the Philistines. Samson died in the Temple of Dagon, but his sacrifice was an act of redemption, not only for him but for all the people of Israel. He who in life had not known how to control his weaknesses found true strength in the moment of his death by surrendering completely to God. Samson's death was, without a doubt, one of the most powerful demonstrations of God's strength in the Bible. Although his life was marked by failures and weaknesses, his final sacrifice brought a grand victory for the people of Israel. The hero who, for so long, trusted in his own physical strength, finally found true strength in his surrender to God. Samson became a symbol of redemption, showing that even in the darkest hours, God can use even our weaknesses to fulfill his plan. Samson's legacy is not in the battles he won with his physical strength, but in the transformation of his life. He who fell because of his impulsive choices and human weaknesses was restored through surrender and faith in God. Samson's final sacrifice was not just a last battle against the Philistines, but proof that God can transform even moments of weakness into spiritual victories. Moreover, the story of Delilah, the woman who betrayed him, teaches us that the choices we make, especially in moments of temptation, can have devastating consequences. Delilah, with her cunning manipulation, was a crucial part of Samson's fall, but her betrayal also reflected the choices he made by trusting in his own strength rather than in God. She represents the temptations we all face and reminds us of the importance of maintaining our fidelity to divine purpose, even when seduced by other forces. The story of Samson challenges us to reflect on our own lives. Where do we seek our strength? Do we trust in our abilities or in God to fulfill our purpose? In our weakness, we can be used for something grand as long as we surrender our hearts and lives to the Lord.